Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. It's just over 2 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and with no likely end in sight, this conflict continues to have profound ramifications across Europe and further afield. Tonight, we're going to delve into some of those. We were scheduled to speak with Kamil Kallas in Warsaw, but sadly he's unwell. So we're joined instead by Professor James Ker-Lindsay, who specialises in Southeastern Europe and Cyprus. Hello and welcome, James.
Good evening there, Nicholas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You are actually in Cyprus, and we might talk about that in a bit.
Indeed, yes. Just moved over about 6 months ago, so getting settled back in on the island. I lived here before, but we can go into that.
Okay, well, we will come to that because we are hoping to travel with you, if possible, in May. So watch this space. More about that a bit later, I hope. I'm going to start very briefly with the Baltics. If you think about the Baltic states, the reaction there to Russia's invasion has been very clear cut. Arm Ukraine and defend yourselves. But as we head further south, and particularly as you get nearer to the Balkans, that sort of division becomes more murky, if you like, and that's what we're going to focus on now. Let's start today with Hungary. What's Hungary just done?
Well, as many may have seen, I mean, the news broke that finally Hungary has, the Hungarian parliament anyway, has sort of ratified Sweden's membership of NATO. So within days, we could be talking about NATO now expanding to 32 members. Of course, we had Finland that joined last year, but Sweden was held up for a whole bunch of reasons, mainly to do with Turkey, but Turkey had dropped its veto over this, and it was just Hungary. We were waiting to see what happened, and of course this is all tied in with the very questionable relationship that the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has with Russia. But also it was an element of trying to sort of strong arm his European partners on a whole range of things. I mean, Hungary is in a very, very strange place at the moment. It's becoming more and more authoritarian. And there is also, as I say, this deep concern about the relationship between Orban and Moscow. So what we've seen today with Hungary finally ratifying Swedish membership of NATO is certainly a very, very big move. And I think symbolically we can recognise the implications of it, but also militarily. I mean, this is big news. So important day.
Yeah. James, do you think it's possibly, what really shocks me is that you have to go back to 1956, and most Hungarians who have memories of that would be, I think, pretty shocked or appalled by the idea of an alliance, a close alliance between their leaders and Moscow. But I guess time's moved on, and Orban is popular, and he holds a huge amount of sway over the electorate.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting you should mention that, actually, because, I mean, this is what makes Orban such an interesting figure in many ways, is that, he politically started off as a very liberal democratic figure. I was working on sort of, I have a YouTube channel of my own, and I was doing something recently on NATO, and I pulled up the footage of the first NATO expansion after the end of the Cold War, which is in 1999, when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined. And what was absolutely fascinating was that Orban was the Hungarian prime minister, and he was giving this passionate speech about how important it was that, Hungary and the former Warsaw Pact countries were joining NATO. I mean, he looked completely different, very young, svelte sort of figure, which very different from how he looks today. But it was, as I say, this sort of contrast with what he was saying then and what he says now, and the fact is that he's espousing what he openly calls illiberal democracy, and pushing back, and he's become a complete darling of the American right. He's often going and speaking at major sort of American sort of MAGA Trumpist conferences in the United States. And internally in Hungary, he's effectively made it, a fiefdom of his ruling party, Fidesz. And it's become a huge problem for the European Union as well. How do we deal with a figure like Orban? So it's a very, very worrying trend. But you're absolutely right. I think, many Hungarians, certainly of a certain age, would be absolutely appalled to see, the way that he's transformed politically and moved much closer to Russia.
Ultimately, this is just leverage. It's not that he sincerely believes in a close alliance with Moscow. He's far enough away for Russia not to be a threat as far as he sees it, and it enables him to get more Griffin fighters in terms of keeping Sweden out of NATO for a while.
Exactly. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, it was, as people put it, it was Orban just giving a shakedown. But what was interesting is the European Union had been playing a certain game with him for a long time, sort of just trying to coax him into taking moderate positions. But there have been very interesting reports recently that, for example, the European Union was now starting to look very seriously at the potential financial levers it could have. And essentially, I mean, Orban's been kept in power through a massive network of patronage through his ruling party, which has been effectively bankrolled by the European Union. And so there was real talk that the EU was going to say, right, okay, we're going to cut off the funds and watch how quickly when Orban is unable to then provide that patronage, the unrest sort of increases. And I think he realized that he was just going to have to start showing a bit of goodwill, and this was obviously a crucial step.
I watch this space. I think that's a sort of key question: what the EU can do, or more broadly in terms of how it deals with Russia's influence across Europe. But what can it do in terms of what levers it has in individual countries? And that's so I think going to be a current theme of this conversation. Let's leave Hungary to the side. Moldova. I mean, I think many people watching here know that we're running a tour there also in June. We were in Transnistria in September. A lot's happening there. Just to make it clear, Transnistria, the Russian-backed breakaway state, has been there since the early 90s and still has Russian peacekeeping troops there. Troops left there after the conflicts in the early 90s. And it's also got a very large sort of military stash of weapons, which I think are probably pretty decrepit by now, actually. So that's the situation. It's got its own sort of little fiefdom. Do we see any change there? How's the war affected that?
Well, I mean, this has been one of the really, really interesting stories, if you like, because, I think for a lot of people who look at Moldova and would have assumed, there's a gap between Russia and Transnistria, and that gap is Ukraine. And so the real sense was that, unlike, for example, Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, which actually, are contiguous with Russia, and so Russia is in a much stronger position to defend it. The argument is, well, the Russians aren't in a strong position to defend Transnistria. There's a garrison, I think the figure is probably about 1,500 Russian troops, so it's certainly not big. And there's a real question is, maybe why hasn't Moldova seized the opportunity to retake Transnistria by force, given that obviously Russia is tied up elsewhere, and any attempt by Russia to reinforce the garrison in Moldova would require what would eventually be a very, very risky, or one would imagine, operation to fly troops across Ukraine to do that, which, probably would be too difficult at the moment. And this sort of partly explains why very early on in the war in Ukraine, there was so much focus on Russia pushing south across the south of Ukraine to Odessa, to be able to then push up and sort of link up with the troops in Transnistria, reinforce it, and then you've sort of almost created this sort of pincer movement on Ukraine. So it was seen as strategically very important, but of course, Russia wasn't able to get that far. But there is this really, really interesting question about Moldova. Moldova's a fascinating country. I mean, it's obviously the poorest country in Europe, a former Soviet republic. But it's also constitutionally neutral. So although it's applied to join the European Union, unlike, for example, Ukraine, unlike Finland, unlike Sweden and these other countries which have said, right, okay, we feel an existential threat to our security from Russia, Moldova actually, as I say, constitutionally now, there's the whole argument, could it change the constitution to do that? It doesn't seem like it wants to at the moment, but it's a truly fascinating situation in all sorts of ways. And just worth mentioning as well that we focus very much on Transnistria, but there's also another absolutely fascinating region in Moldova, which is an area called Gagauzia, which is an autonomous interesting because the Gagauz are actually Turkic in origin, but they became Russified during the Soviet Union. And that is often seen also as another, if you like, source of leverage that Moscow has over the government in Moldova. So Moldova is.
Yeah, I was really struck by how Russian the population, and this is one of the things you learn by sort of traveling to places, literally.
Yes.
I Moldova, Romanian majority, but really in the cities, the middle classes are Russian speaking, but not necessarily at all. I found people very hostile to Putin. Just as you might be Russian speaking in Ukraine, a parallel there. But the key thing that I came away with was the energy politics and the fact that Russia has been supplying Transnistria free Russian gas, and that Russian gas was then the energy produced from that was sold on to Moldova, and that Moldova was held beholden to that. But very cleverly, and we were there as the minister was actually going through the reassessment of the debt that they would owe to Russia, and cutting that debt, actually finding a way of basically saying that they only owe Russia $8 million as opposed to $700 million is what the Russians were claiming. They worked with, I think, a Norwegian consultancy to reassess that debt. And essentially, they have found a way of weaning themselves off Russian gas. And this puts Transnistria in a very delicate position because they had free energy. And I think from next year, they won't have it anymore.
Absolutely, and I mean, what also makes it very interesting is that there's a tendency to think that as you pointed out, I mean, the Moldovans are have a very close relationship with Romania. I mean, you get into very, very difficult territory when you start talking about ethnic. But they recently renamed their language from Moldovan to Romanian as a quite clear indication that they are Romanians. And if you look at the two flags, I mean, they're incredibly similar. And one of the other debates that's often been had is, what happens if Moldova suddenly says, well, actually, why don't we unite with Romania? I mean, there's a whole other discussion to have on that, which is fascinating. But certainly
you will
Moldova.
Find people in Transnistria who are living in Transnistria who have got Romanian passports. Because obviously the advantage of the Romanian passport is they can travel throughout the EU and work in the EU.
Yes.
So
but what's interesting, of course, is as you say. I mean, we think that you've got that western part of the big bulk of Moldova, which we think is of Romanian, and then we think, oh well, Transnistria is this sort of hangover of the Soviet era, which is just full of Russians. And of course, when you look at the ethnic breakdown of Transnistria, it's actually pretty much a third Ukrainian, third Russian, third Romanian. Or Moldovan, Romanian, and so you've got a very, very complex situation, which is and obviously there's the whole criminality element that's driven this, over the years and things like that. It's this ambiguous sort of border areas that we have in Europe. So a very, very interesting case, Moldova, and another one to watch. But of course, now that it's also on the path to EU accession, it's got a very pro-EU government at the moment. Is giving people a lot of reason for hope, but it can turn. There is still a fairly substantial body of opinion, which is, as you say, pro-Russian, if not, pro-Putin.
Yeah. No, I mean, so that if we're rushing through our list of countries, Hungary's there. We know he's Orban's pro-Putin. Moldova currently very pro-EU, very pro-Ukraine, and I think Transnistria's days are numbered, but I know it's going to be complex. If we go, let's move. We're going to skip Romania to a degree, but I know Romanians are pretty anti-Russian. Serbia, very, very different case. If we were to choose an example of a country where there's ambivalence towards Ukraine and a warmness towards Russia, Serbia is the one to look at.
Yes, I mean, but so as we've been speaking about, I mean, Serbia is a country I know very well. I've spent a lot of time there, and I think I'm always very cautious when I hear people commenting on Serbia's close relationship with Russia, because it's a very long and complex history, and it isn't nearly as close, or it hasn't traditionally been nearly as close as people often like to think. So, I often say, and this comes from an anecdote from a very dear friend of mine many years ago, who, he used to love to say how much he loved the Russians. And so I just get a Serb drunk and they'll tell you how much they love the Russians, get a Serb really drunk and they'll tell you how much they hate the Russians. There is this, as I say, extremely complex relationship. They don't trust the Russians terribly. But what you often find in these situations, and you see it time and time again, is small countries that feel that they've got grievances, and especially when those grievances are directed towards the West, as they are with Serbia because of Kosovo. You sort of cling on to whoever you think can be a friend. And of course, Russia has blocked Kosovo's membership of the UN, and along with China, interestingly enough. But it's really Moscow's veto in the Security Council, which has been so vital for this. And so the Serbs are actually beholden to Russia for that. And Russia has flexed that considerably. I mean, they bought into the Serbian energy sector. So we get back to that discussion about Russia's, energy politics. And you're absolutely right. This is incredibly important. Russia supplying cheap gas has been vital for so many of these countries. They get cold in winter. And to get this cheap gas keeps those economies turning over. So weaning themselves, we've seen how difficult it was for Germany to do that. But for these countries, which were a lot poorer, it's been a huge thing. But again, as I say, the relationship amongst ordinary Serbs towards Russia has always been a lot more ambivalent. And I just have to tell the story that, many years ago, I remember about 10 years ago, there was all this talk at the time of the Crimea War, when that was sort of breaking out, and how pro-Russian the Serbs were, and that they'd opened up this Cafe Putin in Novi Sad, which is Serbia's second city. Now, I go to Novi Sad fairly regularly. I know it well, as I say, and I had to go and see this place, and it really was literally just a doorway and a fridge with some drinks in it, and that was it. It was nothing at all. And Cafe Putin. But I walked down the road, and 100 meters away was one of the swankiest, nicest restaurants in Novi Sad, which went by the absolutely brilliant name Churchill's. Yeah. That wasn't getting reported. So, for all this international media attention about this tiny little Cafe Putin. But yeah, as I say, you had this. So, it's always been a much more complicated relationship. But where I do worry now is that I think with the war in Ukraine, that it has spilt over into popular sentiment, that there's a real sense amongst many Serbs of the West has gone to war with Russia to protect Ukraine's territorial integrity, but they haven't done that for us. They've granted Kosovo independence. And I think instead of saying, well, we should take the line that we should defend Ukraine's territorial integrity and make the point to the West that our territorial integrity should be protected as well, the Serbs have gone the other way and almost saying, at a popular level, I think Vučić has been, and we can talk about this in a second, but at a popular level, I think many Serbs are saying, they've done a terrible thing to us, and now Ukraine is Russia's revenge, and we're going to stand behind Russia on that. So there isn't a lot of logic, but certainly with Vučić himself, I think he's trod a much finer line than people often realize. So you hear, again, in the media in the West, it's all Vučić is very pro-Russian and everything. He needs Russia. There's no doubt about it in the Security Council. He doesn't want to alienate it. But in all sorts of ways, behind the scenes, I think that there is, he's trying not to alienate the West as well. And it's actually, there's a huge number of Russians who've gone and settled in Serbia. But like a lot of other countries, these are dissidents. These are young people, brain drainers who are going and living in Serbia. They're not terribly pro-Putin. And hopefully that also is filtering out into Serbian society, hearing these Russians saying, look, we've had to leave Russia because of what Putin's doing. He's not this great figure. He's not this savior that you seem to think he is. So, complex situation.
Yeah, and shells being manufactured in factories in Kragujevac that's ending up
exactly.
being Russian.
Yeah, another point
Union
I was
Army.
going to, exactly. You're absolutely right. I mean, as many sort of people watching now, I mean, Serbia actually has quite a large defense industry, and it apparently has been churning out ammunition that's been sent to Ukraine.
Yeah.
So as I say, it's a more complicated situation.
But here's coming back to this the wrestle that the EU has. The EU is meant to be this big magnet attraction for countries in the region. It's sort of aspirational. You get stability with your neighbours, and you would think everyone would want to join it based on that thing. But for autocrats, that's a problem, because you suddenly got to be committed to democracy. Okay, Orban has illustrated that you can be within the club without actually going down that route. But if you're Vučić, you don't want to embrace that too quickly. I mean, look at Sanader, who was the leader of Croatia, was his party, led Croatia to EU. Very soon, he's in jail for corruption. I mean, it's not as simple as that, but you could say, basically authoritarian figures don't do well in the EU's democratic setup. And this conflict gives you an opportunity to hold back from that.
Yes, I mean, there is that difficulty. I mean, I often thought that Orban is a very interesting and particular type of figure, and I think there is a tendency that people would say, well, Vučić is like Orban, and they have formed quite a close relationship. But I think personality-wise, they're very different from each other. I mean, Vučić is somebody who genuinely wants to be loved and adored, and really feels, look, I've come in, I've done a lot for Serbia, and to his credit, I mean, a lot of people, and again, it's one of these sort of things. You go into Belgrade, the capital city.
You're saying as a cuddly nationalist, this is the guy who sent in, armed groups into northern Kosovo to spark a rebellion that ended up.
Well, I think even on that, we have to be a little bit careful that, was that something that came from Vučić? I think we also have, there are investigations ongoing international on that one. And, it could very, again, it's a very murky picture that we've got at the moment. And, yes, Vučić is in a strong position, but there are also elements within the security services that I think people sort of feel are much more pro-Russian, are much more willing to destabilize the situation. I mean, if you break it down, it does not make sense for Vučić to be stirring up Kosovo in that direct way, because if he wanted to go all in with Russia, yes, then absolutely it makes sense. But if he wants to retain any sort of relationship with the European Union, that is the easiest way to undermine that. And so, I'm a little bit hesitant about saying it. And I'm not going to say that, he is a cuddly nationalist, but I am saying that I think, when you compare him with Orban is ideologically fighting a battle against his partners in Europe, as well as also grifting and the whole corruption. I think Vučić, it's a little bit more of a complicated story.
Okay, I'm apologising for going through this list, but I do want to cover it. Dodik in Bosnia. So Bosnia, I think people who've watched numerous discussions we've had, is really held to this peace agreement from 1995, 96, the Dayton Peace Agreement, which has entrenched these ethnic divisions, and you've got a very complex governing structure, but very loosely, you've got a sort of dual state, or actually it's moving more complex than that, but you've got Dodik and Republika Srpska, and you've got the Bosnian Federation, which is Croats and Bosnians. And Dodik has been incredibly nationalist and has threatened to break away, to break the country up. And he, even more than Vučić, has been flying to Moscow and has had parades for, in front of Russian officials, that kind of thing. But again, is this just saber rattling, or is this very serious? Is there a real serious threat to this?
Well, I think you need to divide it out, but I think the starting point is to recognise that Dodik is a real problem. He is a nuisance and he is dangerous. I think what makes him dangerous is he's talking so much about secession of Republika Srpska, and it's not that Republika Srpska can secede. It would be incredibly difficult. I mean, if it tried, any boundaries that it has with the rest of Bosnia would be closed off. The boundaries with Croatia would be closed off. It then has...
And they're all over the place. I mean, it goes around different housing blocks, and it's just so complicated.
It's very, very complicated. And you've got Brčko, which breaks up Republika Srpska. So it's this sort of international district, which means that the main part of Republika Srpska in the north could be cut off quite easily. And that's where Banja Luka is, which is the capital of Republika Srpska, or the main city, or the second city of Bosnia. And then you would find that if Serbia did anything at all to try and break that, then that again would kill off its EU accession hopes. And so, I think, again, this Vučić finds himself in a much more difficult situation because, again, trying to tread this balance, having to deal with Dodik, who commands a certain degree of support in Serbian public opinion. There's no doubt about it. Maybe not as much as people like to think, but certainly he's going around constantly stirring up this. And I think the thing that really has worried me about it is that it's not so much that Republika Srpska can break away, but the fact that he's saying this. And then what you're seeing is many Bosniak nationalists responding to this, saying, well, we've got to prepare. We've got to, be ready to take up arms if he tries to do this. And the internationals are therefore faced with a very difficult situation of trying to dampen down this tension as Dodik's constantly stirring it up. So it's... And on top of that, you've got this deep, deep stagnation, which has, run into Bosnia. So, for the first 10 years after the Dayton Peace Agreement in 1995, Bosnia looked like it was a country on the mend. We saw a lot of progress to the point that even the Bosnian Serb armed forces were integrated into the Bosnian army, which was probably the greatest single evidence of this improvement. But now we're coming up for what is almost 20 years of deeper and deeper stagnation. And Europe just doesn't quite know how to solve this problem in Bosnia. It's a very, very worrying and also very depressing situation.
Yeah, terrible. Listen, everyone, I'd love to get some questions, so do put your questions in the Q&A box below on your screen, and then you can put your questions directly to James. I do want to talk about Greece. I want to talk about Cyprus in a second. I'll come back to them in a moment. But your specialist area, one of your key interests is states, the relationship between states, and also states that are not recognized and seeking to gain independence. Russia has had, or Putin has made a point of creating statelets. We think of South Ossetia, we can think of Abkhazia, and then obviously when before when the little green men appeared in eastern Ukraine as well. How has this war affected those? I mean, there's a whole international relations overall in terms of you're invading somebody else's country, you're seizing it. I would think that people have got a pretty clear idea. You've got to be, sovereignty matters. That state. Yeah. This is a really important thing that's been broken down and threatened.
No, great question. I mean, I think it to my mind, I really do think that this war is incredibly important, and the outcome of it will shape international relations for the rest of this century. I mean, I actually genuinely believe that Ukraine is what we call a systemic war. It's not an interstate war. It goes beyond that. If Putin wins, then it upends the entire international system that was created after the Second World War, which elevated this idea of territorial integrity of states. So you look back into the 19th century, Mike was right. You seized territory, you held it, it was yours. And we moved beyond that. And what I think that we've seen is the way that Putin now has so openly annexed, parts of eastern Ukraine. And it was really interesting that if you look at what he did in Crimea, that was the last vestiges of Russia actually sort of saying, we understand there's an international legal order and we've got to play by the rules. And that sounds really weird when I say it in those terms, but if you look at the way that Crimea was handled, Crimea declared independence and then it requested to join Russia. That was Russia's way out of saying, we respect the principle of territorial integrity, but we also understand that Crimea is no longer part of Ukraine because it's declared independence. And then if they want to take their new sovereign decision to join us, who are we to reject that? So that was, if you like, the last flicker of Russia playing by those rules. And then what we saw is, what happened with Eastern Ukraine, where Russia just signed, right, okay, we're annexing it. But, at this point, I also have to say that, I think the problem that we also have in the West is that, we did our part, if we're to be really honest about it, and look into ourselves in undermining that system in various ways. So that's why you get all these sort of, large parts of the world have actually been a lot more pro-Russian, partly because they say, well, look what you did in Iraq, you invaded, and I'd say, well, look, it's more complicated than that, and Russia's just driven a coach and horses through international law.
I guess you could say, might think the war was unjustified from many aspects, but they didn't annex large parts of Iraq. They didn't.
That's exactly the point. The West went in, and yes, it was a violation of the sovereignty, of the independence of it, but it wasn't done, in order to seize that territory and annex it.
Whereas,
and that's the absolute crucial.
Yeah, whereas Israel it occupies the West Bank and Gaza, but it has annexed Jerusalem, and this has been recognized by the United States.
Yes, and of course it annexed the Golan Heights, which was also recognized by the United States, and the annexation of Golan was absolutely declared to be illegal. According to UN Security Council resolutions. And so there have been interesting cases of annexation, but it's been very rare. Also, the other point to remember, of course, is that the first country that annexed the West Bank was Jordan. After the 1948 war, Israeli War of Independence. So, and then Jordan lost that control, obviously, in the 67 Six-Day War. But actual cases of annexation have been very, very rare in international politics. Countries haven't wanted to seize. And of course, probably the most famous of modern international politics was Iraq's attempt to annex Kuwait, which led to the first Gulf War. But what I think a lot of us who look at international relations, and especially to do with territorial integrity, sovereignty, these issues, is that the way that we're now seeing more and more countries openly saying we're willing to annex the territory. And of course, the other recent one that we had was in South America, where Venezuela recently said that, well, we've annexed part of Guyana. It rolled back on that, or stepped back from trying to send in military troops, partly because Brazil came in and said, no, you're not going to do this. But it certainly was very, very interesting that more and more countries are now talking about this. And I think that this is the real worry that we're facing, that if Russia does get away with this in Ukraine, then the temptation will be for more and more countries to say, and I think Russia also is defending their rights to do that.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's bring that conversation to where you are now. We are going to go to Cyprus in May. This is a problem that's been there since 1974, arguably much earlier than that too. And there have been repeated hopes of negotiations. In 2004, there was the Annan Plan. A vote was put on the possible reunification of Cyprus. The Turkish Cypriots voted in favour, and famously, the Greek Cypriots voted against, and it didn't happen. There have been various attempts since then, but those have broken down. What's happened most recently, and this falls into this same conversation, really about annexation. What's Turkey's position at the moment, and the Turkish Cypriots' position at the moment?
Well, obviously there's a whole long history behind Cyprus, fascinating history that, I've spent 35 years now working on Cyprus. But it's essentially where we stand is that the last big effort by the UN to try and solve Cyprus was in 2017 when, the sides came together along with Britain, Greece and Turkey, the so-called three guarantor powers under the 1960 constitution when Cyprus became independent. These three countries are given responsibility for protecting the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity of the republic. Now, the argument is all three have failed in their own different ways to do that. But essentially, we had this effort in 2017, which sadly failed. It was not through lack of trying, rather, interesting. I was actually at those talks as part of the UK delegation, so saw it up close. And, it's incredible to think that we're coming up now for 7 years. I mean, time really flies. I was here actually in 2004.
But my point, I think, forgive me for sort of jumping the gun slightly, is that Turkey now wants to have Northern Cyprus recognised. In other words, to have the two-state solution. So basically saying we are not. No, don't kid yourselves. These negotiations are going nowhere. The only way we can make progress is by having two sovereign states on this island, and then we can go from then we can discuss things from that point afterwards, and then you can solve things. You can't have. You're not going to have a federation. A bicommunal federation is just not going to work. And this falls in. It falls into this idea of this happened over 50 years ago, but you can seize a country, and it doesn't really matter in today's climate.
Well, I mean, the concern is, will Turkey go for full annexation? I mean, this ties in with that point of, countries talking about it. But I mean, essentially where we are is that we had these UN talks that finished 7 years ago, and there is now a new effort to try and get them restarted. And you're right. I mean, Turkey's talking more and more openly about two-state solution. But the reality is that the UN has repeatedly insisted that a settlement has got to be based on what's called a bizonal bicommunal federation. Now what exactly that means is open to a degree of interpretation by the two sides, but essentially it does mean that there will be one territory that will be predominantly Turkish Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot administered, and the other one Greek Cypriot, and they come together. And it's a question of how much they can agree on the central, the powers of the central government. But of course, you have a nationalist administration in the north, which is pushing this idea of two states. We've got Turkey pushing it at the moment, but I think those who are close to the process are saying that they do still see genuine possibility that for all the talk of two-state solution, that Turkey could be persuaded to get back to the table. Which would be an incredibly, significant step. But, people will often wonder why Cyprus is important. And it's a small island in the Mediterranean, but it is precisely because it's becoming at the moment a fault line between the tensions, and maybe we'll get onto this in a second, between Europe or the West and Turkey. And Turkey obviously is an incredibly important country and, obviously a NATO ally. Although, the term ally in this sense is really doing some heavy lifting with the way that, Turkey has been going. And so in many ways, Cyprus is has a lot of significance. And of course, there are still 2 British military bases on the island, which are sovereign. They're not leased or anything. It was under the 1960 constitution. So for all sorts of reasons, Cyprus actually is a much more significant element in Western security. And of course, the tensions between Turkey and Cyprus as an EU member means that there is also difficulties getting the EU and NATO to cooperate. And so that's also causing a lot of problems and has been causing a headache for 20 years as well. So, for all these reasons, Cyprus is actually a lot more important than it might seem if you just look at it on the map.
Yeah, and what are the Russians? Do the Russians have any influence in this? I mean, I know they got plenty of. They did have lots of money in banks for a while. I don't know if that's still the case, but beyond, and sort of from a geopolitical point of view, and perhaps the UN, what's their influence there?
Well, this has been one of the really, really interesting stories of the last 10 years, is that you're absolutely right. I mean, for a long time, Russia had a lot of significance in Cyprus. Again, partly because many Greek Cypriots felt that, there was some sort of, Britain and the United States were against them and that they needed some support. And obviously, Russia was their key ally in the Security Council. We've seen a dramatic shift in Greek Cypriot thinking over the past 10 years, and it's become more and more overtly Western, pro-Western, pro-Western. Again, it's one of the very few countries now, as of, it's, if I remember rightly, there's now only 4 EU members that are not NATO members. So that's Ireland, Austria, Malta, and Cyprus. So there have been talks that, Cyprus might join NATO at some point. I think that's still a little way off, not least of all because Turkey would certainly block that under current circumstances. But we've definitely seen the Greek Cypriots become much more pro-Western. They've built a very close relationship with Israel, for example, which has also channeled through to their relationship with Washington. So it's been a very, very significant change, which I think has been very, very important and reduced. But again, we've also seen some interesting movements in terms of Russia's relationship with Turkey, which I think has also started to shift Greek Cypriots and Greece into a much more pro-Western stance.
And what is, I mean, again, for Erdogan, it's an ability to play one off against the other. We know lots of goods are going through Turkey. It's a convenient position. It is another bargaining point for him. It's he can use it for leverage.
Yes, exactly. And Erdogan has completely transformed Turkey over the course of, his term in power, which is, effectively, it's 20 years. And, I've been following Turkey since the early 1990s. And so, it really, it's been incredible to see the transformation. And of course, Erdogan's got a very, he's a very interesting character in his own right, very difficult to read, what exactly his motives are. But, he is all controlling in Turkey. But he is getting on. He recently won a new presidential term. And also one of the great changes in Turkey under Erdogan's power was that he moved from a traditional parliamentary democratic system to a US-style presidential system, with him in the top position. And, he has been playing a very, very, sort of tricky game, if you like, with his Western partners and with Russia, and trying to balance between the two. I think, he has a certain degree of admiration for Putin. They've not always had an easy relationship. You may remember, I think it was around 2016 when Turkey shot down a Russian jet, and that led to a couple of years of quite severe tensions between Ankara and Moscow. But, they seem to have patched it up. And, Turkey is still one of the only European routes into Russia now. You can fly via Istanbul, if I'm right, directly to Moscow. So Turkey hasn't been on board in supporting sanctions in the same way that all the other NATO allies have been.
Yeah, okay. Without questions, everyone, I will draw this to a close sooner rather than later. So if you've got any questions, if you're thinking of any questions, please do put them down in that Q&A box very promptly. Otherwise, we're going to wrap this up in about 3 or 4 minutes. And it's late in Cyprus. It's almost 11:45. So at night.
Yes, I know. But I was looking at the sort of the audience spread, and I was thinking it's actually sort of quite genius timing on your part to be able to sort of get such a spread, and it just means that it means a bit of a late night here.
I've got one crucial question coming up in a second, but I know I've got someone in Texas. We've got Alan Livingston, who's in Houston, and he's got a question. Go ahead, Alan. We can hear you. Your mic is open. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I saw where the Ukrainian Navy, or not Navy, but Ukrainian shore batteries or missiles have been able to sink several Russian ships. And I wondered, what is the current situation in Ukraine being able to either import or export products by sea?
Great question. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to say that this isn't terribly, in my area of expertise. But I mean, talking more broadly, of course, what is obviously interesting is when you consider the Black Sea, is that the one way in and out is via Turkey. You've got to go through the Bosphorus. And so that has traditionally given Turkey a great deal of leverage and made it a very significant actor. So I'd have to say from a military point of view, I wouldn't know sort of exactly what the position is of being able for Ukraine to be able to defend those ships going in and out. But I mean, it's a great question, and one that I will he wants to go off and try and find out a little bit more about. But as I say, I mean, in terms of a strategic question, and you start to get into very interesting questions of international law, because the obvious answer is, well, could Russia send more ships into the Black Sea via the Straits, and then you start to get into very, very complex legal questions about has Turkey got the right to stop free passage of ships if it isn't in a state of hostility with Russia, it's not at war with Russia. So there are sort of very old sort of legal regulations and treaties on that.
Alan, there I saw an excellent map. I think it might have been the New York Times, and I was just trying to find it for you. But the shipping is now moving from Odessa along the coast to within the Romanian and Bulgarian coast, and then down to that gap there. And this is off the back of exactly what you say. The Ukrainians now have the ability to strike Russian shipping, any Russian shipping that comes, or both, also some of it in the sea as of, but certainly to the west of Crimea, and that's given them the ability to move goods in and out. And I think the amount of goods coming out is actually significant now. So there has been, to forgive the use of expression, a sea change because of their ability to strike Russian shipping. So good question. If I find that article, I will share that with you.
Thank you very much.
James, it seems to me one of the next big question, and I don't want to possibly exaggerate it too much, but if we have Trump in the White House, he's already said that Russia can do what it likes to anybody who doesn't pay their NATO dues. I mean, I know it's flippant and it's an electioneering. How worried are you when you think about your key point? Do you see is this a systemic problem? Trump is your enemy, isn't he? I mean, he's something you'd be very concerned about. Or am I exaggerating? Or do you think we got through 4 years of it, somehow we muddled through it? It can be dealt with by whether it's the EU or NATO looking after its own interests.
Look, I mean, like a lot of people, I do worry about the prospects of this, but maybe actually from a slightly more unusual perspective. I think one of the things that was very clear is that, the State Department lost a lot of very good people under the first Trump administration. They just simply said, look, it's not worth it. I'm going to take early retirement or going to leave. And I think the United States has really been playing catch up since that. And I think the real worry will be that, it will lose a lot more talent under a second Trump administration. And that's on top of, I think we do have to have genuine questions about, the policy agenda that he'll pursue. And, the question of whether he will be seen as a reliable NATO partner. I mean, the thing is that, obviously we can say that, the words were exaggerated about, I encourage Russia to do whatever it wants. I mean, he didn't exactly say it. I mean, he said if they don't pay, then, and they get attacked, well, they're delinquent. It's on you, let whatever country do the hell you want. But we all understood that to mean Russia. But it's just even opening that window to the idea that Article 5 of NATO, that joint defence clause, which is absolutely central to the alliance, won't be honoured, I think becomes the real concern, especially as you started the whole of this conversation off by talking about the Baltics. And this is where the real fear lies, that, there are Russian populations in the Baltic republics that or the Baltic states that, Moscow could say, well, as we did with Ukraine, we will always defend the rights of Russians wherever they are. And we feel that they're being persecuted and we will march in. And if there's any sense at all that the United States isn't going to be completely committed to this idea of defending those countries, then that makes that something I think that we all worry about. So, yeah, I mean, it's even the perception that the United States isn't going to be fully on board, which is a real worry.
We were in Iowa and we met many Republicans and lovely people, and they were all very happily going to vote for Trump. And I think a significant it's going to be a close run thing, but I bet Trump probably is going to win at this stage. And I think when it comes to foreign policy, most Americans are not interested in it whatsoever. And so there's a real existential risk here that we're talking about that most Americans seem completely oblivious to.
I think there is that, but I think also the concern that we have at the moment is that, there is a very long and dare I say, honourable tradition of isolationism that's run through American politics. And I fully accept that. I mean, there are a lot of people who would just simply say, well, why is it our problem? And, you can obviously paint all sorts of arguments as to why, the United States is obviously an incredibly powerful country and has been able to get to that position because it's been such a force for globalization. I know, you've got all the people who would say globalization is a terrible thing. But of course, no, I mean, it's been very important in all sorts of ways. And the United States has been at the vanguard of that and protecting that system. But there are those who say, well, why should we? I think what really is worrying a lot of observers at the moment is the wing of the Republican Party that isn't isolationist, but actually seems more overtly cheering Putin on. That's the concern that I think a lot of observers have. It's one thing, because you can often say, I think you can reason with the isolationists and say, listen, why it's in the United States' interests, and the whole argument about pulling out of NATO. I mean, yes, the American government spends a huge amount of money on defense. But, as often pointed out, that budget would include a lot of items that in most other countries would be picked up by other government departments. So, for example, the US research funding, you would not believe how much of that comes from the Department of Defense budget. It's absolutely enormous. That in most other countries would come from an education ministry or a science ministry or whatever. You've got that for education, you've got that for healthcare. So there's all sorts of other things that are wrapped up in it that makes it a little bit more complicated. But the US also benefits enormously from this alliance. In terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of, technology. I mean, the US develops a lot of technology, but other countries do as well. And a lot of them are US partners. It gives the US global reach. There are all sorts of advantages. And I think, with the isolationists, you can reason that. But where you start to get into that element that seems more overtly pro-Russian, that's cheering Russia on, that doesn't actually see the importance of why Russia needs to be defeated in Ukraine, then that becomes a real worry, I think, for a lot of observers.
Let's have a quick comment from Diane Cook, and then we'll take Sheila de Beleg's question. So, Diane Cook.
Yeah, I mean, it's not flippant, but I'm listening to all this and I'm thinking the only country that has benefited from Article 5 of the NATO Charter is guess who?
You're thinking about Afghanistan. You're thinking about
yes. I mean that's exactly that. And a very good point. The one and only time that Article 5 has ever been invoked was you're absolutely right. It was in September 2001. So yes, United States, and but again, as I say, I think I understand why a lot of Americans would feel very unhappy and saying we more than meet the 2% GDP threshold that NATO is meant to do. And as I say, I think we need to be a little bit careful that it isn't always like for like. It is a bit of apples and oranges because of the way that government spending is done in the United States.
I think most of the Greek
countries.
budgets, Greek defence budgets on salaries. But there we go.
And also Greece has got conscription. Which one wants to have the latest fancy technology that it needs to sort of keep in its arms race with a NATO ally Turkey. But you're absolutely right. It's also got a lot of soldiers, sailors,
pensions.
Yeah. Oh, it's always a big one, pensions.
Yes.
Seriously, no, I often joke that when we talk about secession, you would not believe how important pensions are in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah. Yes. So I'd love a question from Australia, please. So I can see some Australians. No excuse. Please put a quick question down in the Q&A box so I can come to you. Sheila, your question, please. Sheila de Beleg.
This is a bit of a tag-in question, but I've been wondering what's happening with Russian involvement in Syria in all this. Have they pulled out or are they still there?
Nick, I'm going to have to plead on that one as well,
okay.
as a Southeast European.
Well, the flow. Russia's big problem is manpower and getting enough people to go to the front, and so there have been they've recruited some Syrians and militias who've been there. The Russians still are there. They still have air base. They still got a naval thing in Latakia. I think we need to put this question to Nick Blandford when he's back again. So Nick, who's based in Beirut and obviously looks at Syria closely. So James, you're let off that one. No problem.
Thank you. Sorry, I wish I could hold forth on
the Russians have been going to Nepal. I saw an article, as many as 15,000 Nepalese have served. I can't believe this. I don't know how the figure stands up. 15,000 Nepalese. So just as we go and recruit Gurkhas, the Russians have been recruiting mercenaries from Nepal, and they have served in Ukraine. It's incredible. There we have it. I think I can't see any more questions from Australia, but never mind. Another time. James, I'm very hopeful that we're going to see you in May. Just before we go, what are the key? Cyprus is amazing as a tourist destination, but going there and seeing the problem firsthand, you get to see. Northern Cyprus, its economy, the politics. You get to see the British bases. You get the boundary zone or the green line, which is controlled by the UN. What else could we potentially see?
Well, as you say, I've always felt, somebody who does conflict and people say, which conflict do you do? And you say Cyprus. I've always felt a little bit of a fraud because, it's a very odd experience being here because you have got UN peacekeepers, you've got this green line, and it's not only that we're marking 50 years of the division of the island with the Turkish invasion in 1974, but this is actually coming up in just over a month's time. It's the 60th anniversary of the introduction of the UN peacekeeping force here, UNFICYP, which is one of the longest serving UN missions now. And so, Cyprus, you come here, and as I say, it's a holiday destination, but you've also got, so it really is one of those sort of things of this sort of, I know we use this term a lot, but, an island of contradictions. And it's very clear and seeing the difference between the two sides, the development on the Greek Cypriot side within the republic that is still under the control of the government, which is an EU member. Whereas, of course, you've got the internationally isolated north, which, because of UN Security Council resolutions, you can't do direct trade, although that eased up a little bit after Cyprus joined the EU in 2004. So just actually having this situation of this, looking and yet at the same time seeing the similarities between the people and things. And there's a lot of historic sites as well. You've got Kantara Castle, which is sort of set on these ruins, these Crusader fortresses. Belapais, for example, which is absolutely stunning, lovely place on the Kyrenia mountain range. So, look, as somebody who my ties to Cyprus go back 35 years. I've just moved back to the island because it really is a wonderful place, and it's fascinating, and it's a very, very odd example of a frozen conflict. So, yeah, lots to get your teeth into.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you very much indeed. We are heading to Cyprus between May the 4th and May the 11th. If you're interested in going, anyone, please do get in touch. James, it's been fantastic. It's a difficult task covering so many different places, and you've fielded nearly all of the questions very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry I wasn't able. There were a couple, but as I say, try to keep in depth on so many countries. Southeast Europe is a challenge in itself, but I hope it shed a bit of light on them.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks a lot.